The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chayaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Well, hello. Thank you so much for joining me for a brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. Today's topic has kind of been a long time coming because it's tenuously linked to one of our previous installments. When I posted episode 52 of the show, which was all about the double life of a man named Brandon Lee, quite a few of you said that from the title, you thought I was going to be talking about the late actor of the same name. I then promised that I would make a future episode about the more famous of the two Brandons, specifically about the circumstances that led to his tragic death on the set of the 1994 film The Crow. But as I started looking into the story, I realised that there was a much wider topic linked to this sad tale: the theory that certain films may be cursed. A few quick warnings before we start: that there will be a couple of gruesome details in this episode, brief mentions of a person taking their own life, as well as a plane crash too. But they're all things that are important to mention in relation to the particular supposedly cursed films I'll be discussing. Intrigued? Allow me to explain. Whether you think of the concept of curses as belonging to the paranormal or supernatural worlds, being more in line with superstitions, or just being part of different cultures' folklore, there's no denying that the idea is divisive. While some believe wholeheartedly that a situation or object could be cursed, others think it's absolute nonsense and that any unfortunate events connected to the supposedly cursed thing are merely coincidences. So it's no surprise that the topic of allegedly cursed movies is one that prompts some pretty strong reactions from both the believers and the non-believers. There's really only one film that we can start off this discussion with, and as I alluded to in the introduction, that is, of course, The Crow. Now, if you had a teenage goth phase, or like me, you never really left it, I'm sure that The Crow is something you'll be very familiar with. The film has a dark, gothic vibe with this supernatural edge, and is essentially this huge tale of vengeance which revolves around the main character, played by Brandon Lee, coming back from the dead to avenge both his and his fiance's murders. It's become an absolute cult classic since its release in the mid-90s, and not just because of its story or aesthetics, but because, you could argue, the film's ill-fated backstory is just as well known as its plot. So Brandon Lee was the son of the legendary actor and martial artist Bruce Lee, and was well on the road to following in his dad's footsteps and becoming a big star. However, at the age of just 28 years old, Brandon's story was about to end in tragedy. Whilst on the set of The Crow on the 31st of March 1993, Brandon was filming a scene where his character was due to be fatally shot. The prop gun that was being used on the set was actually a real revolver, which was meant to be loaded with a blank round, but due to some missed safety checks, as the weapons expert was no longer on set, the gun actually still contained part of this sort of improvised dummy bullet that had been previously placed in it. Basically, it was a real bullet with the gunpowder removed. When the cameras started rolling and Brandon was shot with the prop gun, it soon became clear that something had gone very wrong indeed. He was shot in the abdomen for real, and despite the best efforts of the team at a hospital near to the set, he sadly could not be saved and passed away just hours later. Now, when the news of Brandon's untimely death emerged, people were quick to point out the parallels between this awful turn of events and his father Bruce's premature passing. Bruce Lee was just 32 when he died from medical complications, the specifics of which are still being debated to this day, with Brandon being just 8 years old when he lost his dad. And since that awful day on the set of The Crow, many more strange details have come to light about the situation, which have prompted many to ask the question, was the production cursed from the start? According to a 1993 article from Entertainment Weekly, some members of the film's crew were already proclaiming that the project must be cursed almost 2 months before Brandon was killed, due to a series of other unfortunate events that had taken place on the set. On the 1st of February, a 27-year-old carpenter suffered serious burns after a live power line hit the crane he was in, and later on that evening, a parked grip truck being used by production mysteriously caught fire. But that was just the beginning. The article goes on to say, the list of bizarre incidents quickly grew. A construction worker accidentally put a screwdriver through his hand. A disgruntled set sculptor rammed into the Crow's plaster sculpture studio with his car. A drive-by shooting occurred just blocks from a Crow location. On the 13th of March, a terrible storm in the area all but destroyed the set, and by this point, the crew were keeping running tallies of all of the disastrous incidents that befell them. They would even start to joke about it, with the phrase "smiling through the chaos" being used to describe the atmosphere on set. Of course, though, when the absolutely unthinkable happened just weeks later and Brandon Lee lost his life, the joking stopped abruptly. In the decades that have passed since Brandon's death, talk of the Crow curse has only grown louder, with those intrigued by the idea developing several theories around what could have prompted it. And this is where things get very strange indeed. Some argue that the origin of the curse could have been related to the source material for the film itself. The Crow was actually based on a comic book series by graphic artist James O'Barr, who has spoken about creating the work as a way of trying to deal with his grief following the death of his real-life fiancée. When James was 18 years old, his partner Beverly was killed by a drunk driver, and he's been open about channeling the anger and fury he felt following this loss into The Crow, which, of course, is about a man being resurrected to avenge his fiancée's murder. Whilst I'm personally not on board with this idea, it has been suggested that this curse first began with Beverly's killing and translated through to the accidental death of Brandon. The thing I actually find more odd about this point is the fact that Brandon himself was actually engaged at the time he was killed and was due to marry his fiancée, Eliza Hutton, almost directly after The Crow was due to finish filming. This is an element I actually haven't heard discussed all that much in relation to this theory, but I think this is the part that makes it feel especially eerie. Honestly, it's just absolutely heartbreaking all around. And whilst this next theory is no less sad, it's arguably much more on the bizarre side. So, there have been murmurings for years about an alleged family curse that was said to run through the male line of the Lee family. Some sources say that Brandon's grandfather had had a curse put on him after a business deal went wrong. After he passed away age 64, it's thought that Bruce then predicted that he himself would die when he reached half the age his father had, which would have been 32. And this, of course, is the age he was when he died. Whilst it's unclear whether Brandon believed in this family curse, what we do know is that prior to his death, he had confided in fellow actor Brad Pitt that he was convinced he was going to die young like his dad Bruce had. Brad revealed this in an interview with Esquire magazine back in 2019, which only added further fuel to the theory. I've even read some articles where it's alleged that a mysterious voicemail was left for the production team prior to the shoot taking place, saying that there would be terrible consequences if they went ahead with filming. filming. But like with so many aspects of this story, it's something I just wasn't able to verify. The entire idea that the crow was cursed has definitely been labelled as nothing more than an urban legend in more recent times. But like with any odd story, there will always be those who insist something wasn't quite right. And here we get to the part that I find strangest of all. This is definitely more of a wild coincidence than a link to the curse idea, but it's truly compelling nonetheless. So here we go. When Bruce Lee passed away in 1973, he was partway through making a film called Game of Death that he had written and was co-producing and starring in. In the film, Bruce plays an actor called Billy Lowe, and in one of the key scenes, we see that Billy is on set filming a sequence, when out of nowhere, he's shot and almost killed by a man with a real gun. Although the circumstances are somewhat different, I find all of this so incredibly odd. What are the chances of, 1, this scene existing and reflecting how his son would go on to pass away in real life 20 years later, and 2, that it was this film that Bruce was partway through making when he died, mirrored by Brandon dying before The Crow was finished. Both films were eventually completed with the use of stunt doubles and special effects, but the fact that these sets of circumstances have so much in common is honestly spooky to me. Even if the Crow curse and the Lee family curse are simply just urban legends, you have to admit that there is something genuinely haunting about these links between the deaths of Bruce and Brandon. However, The Crow is far from the only film that's brought up when the topic of alleged movie curses is mentioned. So from here, let's turn our attention to some of the others. And weirdly enough, most of the films that are frequently cited as being potentially cursed do sit within the genres of horror or thriller, although there is one notable example of a family-friendly classic that is said to have a much darker side to it when you take a peek behind the curtain. That may or may not be a hint, by the way, but you'll have to stay tuned to find out. First though, we have to talk about The Exorcist. This 1973 horror is thought of by many as one of the scariest pictures of all time, and you can see why. Not only is it about demonic possession, which most people would find a little bit unsettling in itself, but more specifically it's about the demonic possession of a young girl whose head spins around and faces backwards at one point, so all in all it's not exactly feel-good viewing. And if you believe that a film set really could be cursed, you could argue that events that took place before The Exorcist even started shooting might have been a sign that things were heading in that direction. Just before filming began, a fire actually destroyed the majority of the set of the McNeil family home, except for the part that was due to be used as the bedroom of the possessed girl, Reagan. For reasons that are hard to explain, that section of the set was untouched by the flames. Whether you look at this as lucky or unlucky is up to you, but what you can't deny is that it's definitely a bit weird. When the set was rebuilt and filming was finally able to start, 2 of the cast members were hit by personal family tragedies which halted the production on both occasions. Firstly, Max von Sydow, who played Father Merrin, lost his brother unexpectedly. Not long afterwards, Linda Blair, who was playing Reagan, lost her grandfather, with both key actors then, of course, taking leave to attend their loved ones' funerals. But according to Ellen Burstyn, who played Reagan's mother in the film, these 2 awful losses were only part of the story, as she claims that during the production period, a total of 9 people who were somehow connected to the cast or crew passed away. One of the deaths that made up this incredibly disconcerting number was that of actor Jack McGowan, who portrayed film director Burke Dennings in The Exorcist. Soon after he had completed filming his scene scenes. He actually passed away at the age of just 54 years old from complications of the flu. And as the film was still in production at the time, it meant that Jack was never able to watch his last performance on the big screen before he passed. And as if all of this awful loss wasn't enough for one production to bear, both Linda Blair and Ellen Burstyn were about to experience life-altering injuries whilst filming some of the movie's most infamous scenes. Whilst young Linda was hooked up to a harness for a possession sequence, she fractured her spine whilst the bed she was in was moving mechanically to mimic her convulsing, and this injury actually led to her developing scoliosis. Linda has talked about how she was screaming out for help, asking for the movements to stop, but because this reflected what was meant to be happening in the scene, no one realised that she was genuinely hurt. She revealed, quote, "That's the footage they used in the movie, where I'm crying my eyes out because they are brutally damaging my back. Can you even imagine?" Ellen Burstyn also suffered a lower back injury from an incident where she too was in a harness. Her character was meant to look like she'd been pushed to the floor by her daughter's demonic powers, and to achieve the effect, she had to be pulled back in her harness by a crew member. During the take, her harness was pulled much too hard, and Ellen fractured her coccyx, which led to her experiencing long-term pain and discomfort. Now, with all of these incidents mounting up, the cast and crew of The Exorcist started to wonder what on earth was going on. While some of them have spoken about believing that the events were just unfortunate, and that statistically you were bound to have some negative things happen during such a long shoot, others were far more convinced that something out of the ordinary was at play. So much so that the film's director actually invited a real-life priest who was acting as a consultant on the movie to perform a real exorcism on the set. The priest, Father Thomas Birmingham, actually told the director that he didn't want to alarm anyone further and didn't think that a full-on exorcism was warranted, but he did still go forward and perform blessings on everyone involved with the production. So he must have thought that there was something strange going on at the very least. And the bizarre happenings reportedly didn't stop after production on the film came to a close either. It's said that several screenings of the movie resulted in distressed viewers requiring medical attention, and that during one particular showing of the film in Rome, a bolt of lightning struck a church opposite the cinema, which many took as an eerie omen given the subject matter of The Exorcist. And speaking of omens, I think it would have been impossible for me to have put this episode together without mentioning one of the most highly discussed, supposedly cursed films of all time. I am, of course, talking about The Omen. There are almost too many terrible events linked to this 1976 classic horror film to mention, and when you consider that it's a tale full of chaos and killing at the hands of a child who turns out to be the Antichrist, you start to see why some people think that these incidents are too odd to be mere coincidences. From two separate occurrences of lightning hitting planes carrying either cast or crew members to the sets, to stuntmen being turned on by the animals they were in scenes with, not to mention the myriad of near misses those involved in the production encountered during the filming process, including being in the vicinity of bombings, plane crashes, and further lightning strikes. Honestly, when you read about it all, you're left feeling like those making The Omen were one step away from disaster at all times. But the incident I wanted to focus on telling you about was, tragically, not a near miss at all, but a genuinely awful accident accompanied by some unthinkably creepy details. This is truly gruesome, so do feel free to skip forward a minute or so if you'd prefer, but otherwise this is the terrible tale of the death of Liz Moore. Liz was a renowned sculptor who had worked on The Omen as an assistant to special effects expert John Richardson. Some sources state that the pair were actually in a relationship, And shortly after the film had been released, they were driving together in the Netherlands when they got into a horrendous car crash. Whilst John was largely unharmed, Liz lost her life in the most hideous way imaginable, as she was actually decapitated during the accident. She was just 31 years old. Now, under any circumstances, this would be truly horrific news, but as more and more details emerged about the crash, the whole incident started to feel not just tragic, but also quite sinister. Firstly was the fact that the accident had taken place on a Friday the 13th, and if you've listened to our very first Weird Fix mini-episode, you'll know that this date is considered by some to be highly unlucky or even ominous. Secondly, many pointed out that the dreadful way in which Liz died felt much too close to one of the most infamous scenes in The Omen, a scene closely worked on by John Richardson himself, which shows a character being decapitated. There is a third point that's often cited in articles about Liz's death, which claims that directly after the accident, John saw a road sign near to the crash site providing directions to the city of Omen, spelt with 2 M's, stating that the distance to it was 66.6 kilometers. Now, it's important to say that this detail has been somewhat disputed over the years, as road signs in the Netherlands wouldn't be this specific about the fraction of the kilometer. However, within the general area of where the crash happened, there are some smaller kilometer marker signs, as well as some separate general signs which do reference Omen. So it's believed that although no road sign exists which says 66.6 kilometers to Omen, it's very possible that John did see multiple signs and distance markers which did display these details. It's just that they were separate and not on one sign. I still find this incredibly creepy, especially when you think about all of the other bizarre incidents that had taken place during the production of The Omen. To then have such a sad and strange turn of events so soon after it premiered, involving such baffling coincidences, you can understand why so many people mention this film straight away when the topic of movie curses comes up. Poor Liz and poor John, it's truly the stuff of nightmares. Whilst there are countless other allegedly cursed horror films I could mention today, from Rosemary's Baby and the Poltergeist trilogy to the first 2 Annabelle movies, there are a couple of films from other genres that I absolutely wanted to make sure I mentioned in this episode. One of them is a legendary flick adored by generations of young and old alike to this day, but the other is not actually a singular film at all, but rather a supposedly jinxed role. So I'm going to begin this final section by telling you about what some refer to as the Superman curse. Now, if you're anything like me, the person you'll still think of as soon as someone mentions Superman is the one and only Christopher Reeve. Although he wasn't the first actor to portray the beloved superhero, you could argue that Christopher's embodiment of the character is still, to this day, the most iconic. Even now, almost 50 years after he first appeared on screen as Superman, it's still common to hear the casting described as nothing short of perfect. But sadly, as you may know, Christopher Reeve is remembered not just for the roles he played, but also because of the terrible accident that changed his life forever back in 1995. On the 27th of May of that year, Christopher was out riding the horse he had purchased after developing an interest in equestrianism several years earlier. They were practicing fence jumps when his horse suddenly stopped mid-leap, causing Christopher to fall backwards and land on his head, which resulted in major spinal damage. Although he later regained some small movements, Christopher was largely paralyzed from the neck down. He showed incredible strength during his rehabilitation though, and actually went on to become a leading disability legislation activist. His story is beyond inspiring. If you don't know much about Christopher Reeve, I would highly recommend reading up on his amazing work. But sadly, after suffering numerous medical complications, he passed away back in 2004 at the age of just 52. His untimely passing not only prompted waves of tributes, but later also caused some to reflect on the fates of numerous other people connected to the Superman franchise, whose lives had also ended well before their time. Now, the first man to ever play Superman on TV was the actor George Reeves, who took on the role in the Adventures of Superman series, which ran from 1952 to 1958. His work on the show made him a star of the small screen, but it seemed that he was always concerned that playing Superman would cause him to be taken less seriously as an actor in general. However, shortly after finishing his run as the Man of Steel, it appeared that George took his own life following an evening out with his fiancée in 1959, after he was found with a gunshot wound to his head. But almost immediately afterwards, questions started to be raised about what had really happened to George that night. A whole host of issues in his private life, combined with some suspicious circumstances surrounding his passing, including the fact that no actual evidence existed showing that he had been the one to pull the trigger, meant that all sorts of theories emerged around the possibility that he had, in fact, been murdered. This debate is still discussed today, and it's fascinating to look into. But the idea of the Superman curse doesn't stop with George. Yet another terrible tale linked to this harrowing theory is that of one of the youngest people to ever portray the character. In the 1978 Superman film, which starred Christopher Reeve, a young British boy named Lee Quigley appeared as the infant version of the superhero. But rather than this role signifying the start of a long career in show business, Lee's life, which was by all accounts quite troubled, was cut brutally short after he passed away in 1991 at the age of just 14. For 3 of the Superman actors to have died under such awful circumstances is strange enough, of course, but it's often been pointed out that this isn't even the full picture. There are several other actors who played different roles within the Superman universe who some believe could also be considered part of this curse. From the comedian Richard Pryor, Gus Gorman in the 3rd Christopher Reeve Superman film, who attempted to take his own life in 1980 by setting himself on fire, to the recent and incredibly mysterious passing of Gene Hackman, who famously played Lex Luthor. Like with many of the apparently cursed films we've already talked about, there are strong opinions on both sides about whether there's any truth to the theory. And as the franchise is still going strong, I have no doubt that it will continue to be discussed for a long time to come. And I suppose the same could also be said for the final movie I wanted to tell you about today. As you may have guessed from my little clue earlier on, I'm talking about the 1939 classic The Wizard of Oz. I must have watched this film 100 times during my life. I absolutely loved it as a kid, and honestly, I still think it's magical even now. But as it turns out, the making of the movie was not quite as wonderful as you may think, to the point that The Wizard of Oz has gained a spot on many lists of purportedly cursed films. Although it's very important to note that in this instance, I think you could put the majority of these issues down to a lack of health and safety precautions. After all, the film was made in the 1930s. We're talking about almost a century ago. But nevertheless, you can't deny that for some of those involved, it probably felt like there was something cursed about their time on set. Take the original Tin Man actor Buddy Ebsen, for example. Just 9 days after filming began, he was hospitalized after being essentially poisoned by the silver makeup that he had to wear for the role, which was made of pure aluminium dust. Very, very dangerous indeed. And as the studio felt he wasn't making a quick enough recovery in hospital, he was actually replaced by the actor millions now associate with the role, Jack Haley. Thankfully, Jack's makeup was applied in a slightly less toxic manner, but it still wasn't ideal and would never be used today. The actress who played the Wicked Witch of the West, Margaret Hamilton, also endured a terrible incident on set which involved her makeup. After a special effect went wrong, Margaret suffered some serious burns to areas of her face and hands. And if you're familiar with the movie, you'll know that these are parts of Margaret's body that would have been painted green for the role. As if the burns weren't bad enough, it turns out that the green paint used on her was copper-based. And after she sustained her injuries, it had to be quickly removed so that it didn't get into her wounds and become even more toxic. In addition, there have also been countless stories about the alleged mistreatment of the lead actress Judy Garland on the set. Judy was just 16 when she was cast as Dorothy, and haunting stories detailing everything from the intense restrictions that studio executives put on her diet to her being physically assaulted for getting things wrong in takes have swirled for decades. I think it's safe to say that there was certainly a dark side to this film that was, by the end, so full of colour. So, after diving into the backstories of all of these apparently cursed films, where do I stand on the debate? Do I really think that some of these legendary productions, or more accurately, the people involved in them, were doomed from the very beginning? I have to say that, on balance, I'm leaning more towards the skeptical side on this one. Don't get me wrong, I think that some of these tales are just plain bizarre, most notably the tragic coincidences surrounding Brandon Lee's death, and the awful events that took place during and after the filming of The Omen 2. Plus, it's vital to say that there are many other examples of allegedly cursed movies that I didn't even get to in this episode, so I can completely understand why so many people believe in this as a concept. Also, I think the discussions around these films, as well as The Exorcist, feel more compelling within this debate because of the possible reasons behind the curses. Something about the notion of a movie about the Antichrist being cursed seems somehow more likely than it would for a rom-com, for example. However, when it comes to films like The Wizard of Oz, I think the unfortunate happenings on that set are likely much more to do with a lack of safety precautions or even knowledge in the case of the makeup issues, as well as much wider problems of safeguarding when it comes to the treatment of Judy Garland. And with the Superman franchise, this one's tricky, as I definitely think it's odd that 3 of those who played the superhero passed away under tragic circumstances. But when you consider how many actors have portrayed Superman over the years, I think this adds a little more context in terms of the statistical chances of these unfortunate events occurring. I will admit that the idea of curses is quite scary to me. I don't want to believe they're real, so I think that pushes me further into the skeptical camp too. But whatever the truth behind all of this is, there's no denying that the entire topic is incredibly intriguing, and I for one know that I'll never see any of these films in quite the same way again. Well, I kind of feel like I ran a marathon putting this episode together. Every time I went down a different avenue, there was so much new information to take in, but it was all so fascinating. What do you make of the idea that a movie could be cursed? Do you feel strongly one way or the other about this debate, or are you kind of hovering somewhere near the middle like me, perhaps a little more to one direction? These subjects are always some of the most fascinating to discuss with you all after the episode, because you always end up introducing me to brand new ways of looking at things. So as always, please do get in touch and share your ideas and theories. They are always so interesting to read. But before all of that, we still have one last section of today's episode to go. So without further delay, here is our outro feature, Weird Media. Today's weird media recommendation isn't strictly weird, but it is true crime based, which definitely still fits in the criteria for the feature. It's also a heavier one than usual. I would actually describe it as nothing short of harrowing, because it's the new Netflix documentary called Kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. If you already know the details of Elizabeth's story, then this won't come as a shock, but a huge trigger warning for discussions of sexual assault and crimes against minors if you were planning to give the film a watch. In general, I have to admit that I've started to find some true crime documentaries hard to watch because of the way that they tend to focus heavily on the perpetrators rather than the victims. But this film is completely different because it's actually told in part by Elizabeth herself, especially the second half, with her sister, dad, and uncles also playing major roles in the telling of the story. So it's very much centered on the victims and the survivor of this awful ordeal, which took place in the US state of Utah back in 2002. If you don't know what happened to Elizabeth, I'm sure you've gathered from the title that she was kidnapped, but she was actually taken from her bedroom in the middle of the night whilst her poor little sister was in the same room. I won't tell you any more than that, as it's all explained in the film, but what I will say is that whilst what happened to her is so distressing and heartbreaking, seeing her now is so impactful and emotional and inspiring. She really is an amazing person. It's choking me up a bit thinking about the ending of the documentary in particular, and you'll see what I mean if you do choose to watch it. Elizabeth really is incredible. As I say, you can find the film on Netflix, and whilst it's definitely not an easy watch, it's something that I'm sure will stay with you for a long time after you finish it. A big thank you for tuning in to Things Are About to Get Weird today. It's wonderful, as always, to have you here. I'll be popping shout outs to all of the sources I used during my research in the show notes or description box, along with links if you'd like to check them out and have a good old read for yourself. I'll also be listing all of our social media pages and our email address for you too. Please do get in touch on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, or even TikTok, and share all of your thoughts about today's story, whether you're a believer or a skeptic. If you've enjoyed this episode and have a spare moment or two, I am always so appreciative of a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you once again for joining me today, and I'll be back very soon with another fascinating, strange but true tale to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.